On a cold November morning in 1910, a long-bearded religious pilgrim, one of thousands wandering Russia at that time, died in an obscure, rural train station. He'd shown up 10 days before, suffering from pneumonia, and out of kindness, the station master had granted him a small apartment in which to die. As he lay there, suffering over the course of days, he muttered strange things to himself, recorded by a small group who'd gathered to witness the old man's passing. "I love many, many things," he would say, and "the truth, I love the truth," he muttered repeatedly. And at last, just before the moment of his dying, he asked a single, unambiguous question: "How does a peasant die?" These seemed fitting last words to all that heard them. All knew that the dying old man had spent most of his life asking the inverse of that question: how does a peasant live? That long-bearded wanderer was Leo Tolstoy, who, despite all appearances to the contrary, died one of the most famous men in the world. Not just known for his epoch-defining novels, but as a radical Christian anarchist, with an entire sect bearing his name and numerous utopian communities following his principles. He'd at different times in his life been a groundbreaking war correspondent, memoirist, war hero, sworn enemy of the Orthodox Church, and repentant baron, who at 19 had inherited the title of Count, 5,000 acres, and over 1,000 human beings. He would try all his life to shed those things and become what he thought all human beings should be: a humble, devout, and unassuming peasant laborer, free of possessions, greed, and even the last shred of what we modern people might call rational self-interest. But to understand how Tolstoy came to lie and die in that train station, asking that final, fateful question, one has to travel all the way back to Tolstoy's earliest memories of childhood, when at 6 years old, he and his siblings would explore the vast estate that would one day be theirs. On one of these adventures in the forests and fields around the family's mansion, Tolstoy's older brother Nikolai told him that somewhere on the estate was buried a green stick, on which was written the secret to making all men perfectly loving, perfectly happy, and equal. In his memoirs, Tolstoy recalls searching for that stick and truly believing in it. The place where he believed the stick to be hidden would even become sacred to him. That search for a complete and perfect solution to man's suffering and infighting would define the rest of Tolstoy's life. He'd later write that the truth written on the stick was real. Only adults forget that it's so. But his searching the estate for the green stick would be the closest Tolstoy would come to his ideal for a very, very long time. For the next 20 years, Tolstoy would wander, utterly lost and cut off from all that might have given his life meaning. He was a man constantly tormented by his own desires, from at least his early teens when his brothers began taking him along to brothels. At 14, he lost his virginity in this way, and later confessed to a friend that afterwards, he stood by the woman's bed and openly wept. In fact, the entry that begins Tolstoy's lifelong habit of journaling was written when he was just 18 and a patient in his university's venereal disease clinic. From that very first entry, he used these journals as a way of both admonishing himself for his moral failures and aspiring to something more. He reserves half the pages for listing these moral failings, and the other half for lists of rules for living a clean life, which include waking up at 5 a.m., staying away from women, and working hard on his coursework. But it seems that he rarely lived up to these well-laid plans for moral improvement. The diaries are above all a record of failure, wherein we see an absurdly privileged teenager constantly chiding himself for sleeping in, laying around, and every night returning to the brothels, even whilst despising himself for doing so. Not long after this torturous period in university, Tolstoy would come into his family's massive inheritance and drop out. Thus began what would be one of the darkest periods of his life. Rather than rising to the level of his journal's highest aspirations, Tolstoy fell instead into the stereotypical life of an immoral, dissolute young aristocrat. Although Dostoevsky is more famous for his gambling, Tolstoy's losses and moral bankruptcy during this period are perhaps even more stunning. It's known that Tolstoy sometimes lost as much as 3,000 rubles in a single session of gambling. One of his estate's peasants might earn only 20 to 30 rubles in an entire year. A junior officer in the army might earn 400 rubles salary a year. Entire villages were sold off to support Tolstoy's gambling addiction. His diaries and letters from this period are painful reading. We see someone setting fire to money earned not through efforts of his own, but an agricultural system that amounted almost to slavery. Tolstoy knows this at this period, already despises this system but does not change his ways. No amount of self-loathing seems to be enough to give him pause. The draw of the tables is simply too much to resist. One of his letters to his brother demonstrates the level Tolstoy had sunk to. God knows what I have gone and done. I set off for no reason to St. Petersburg, did nothing worthwhile there, just spent a heap of money and got into debt. It's stupid. It's unbelievably stupid. You won't believe how much it's tormenting me. The main thing are the debts which I have to pay, and as soon as possible, because if I don't pay them soon, I will lose my reputation on top of the money. Do this, I beg you. Without telling the aunts and estate manager why and what for, sell the village of Vorotinka to our neighbors. And then, in Tolstoy's journals, he'd write, quite predictably, I have lost heavily at cards. I am ashamed, but I must write it down. I have no firmness, no character. I know beforehand that I shall lose, that it is stupid, dishonorable, and yet I go. It is not the money that torments me, but the consciousness of my weakness. It's not surprising, then, that Tolstoy would seek purification and a kind of restart to his adult life. Like many men in all ages and in all countries, he sought this chance for renewal in military service. He himself describes the decision in the most cynical terms. At 26, I went to the Caucasus and entered the army. I wished to kill the enemies whom I did not know and who had done me no harm. I wished to obtain rank and decorations and glory, and I wished to make money. But before we begin to hero worship the great man, Leo Tolstoy, who rescued himself from a meaningless life by courting military glory and then mining those experiences for grand insights which would later make him a world-famous author, let's try to take an objective look at Tolstoy's life up to this point. All that requires is the stripping away of the 19th century romance, all the sabers and epaulets and medals and cannon fire. We must simply describe Tolstoy's life in modern terms to understand the depths to which he had sank. Imagine the spoiled teenage son of two millionaires, who after their deaths immediately sinks into sex addiction, spending huge chunks of his massive inheritance on expensive escorts and OnlyFans subscriptions and sports betting. His siblings beg him to stop, and he refuses. Instead, he sends them self-pitying text messages and then begs them for more millions of dollars to waste on his addictions. And because of his lack of restraint and selfishness, and the resultant need to sell off pieces of his parents' business, hundreds of middle-class and working-class people lose their jobs. But he keeps going until finally his self-loathing and desire for self-destruction grows so strong that he decides to volunteer for the war in Ukraine. In short, Tolstoy's life up to this point has been nothing short of a disaster. But to his credit, the war wakes him up. He writes a collection of stories recounting his experiences in the Crimean War, and especially the siege of Sevastopol, and this makes him famous. With this book, he arguably pioneered war correspondence, and the stories reveal a mature writer who sees the world and the war not just in terms of his own moral torment, but as part of a much larger story in which the souls of every human being are always at stake. He's already writing from a Christian perspective that would resemble that of his much later writings, even though this is still years before his spiritual awakening. Yes, Tolstoy writes, white flags have been raised on the bastion and all along the trench. The flowering valley is filled with stinking corpses. The resplendent sun is descending towards the dark blue sea, and the sea's blue swell is gleaming in the sun's golden rays. Thousands of men are crowding together, studying one another, speaking to one another, smiling at one another. It might be supposed that when these men, Christians, recognizing the same great law of love, see what they have done, they will instantly fall to their knees to repent before him who, when he gave them life, placed in the soul of each, together with the fear of death, a love of the good and the beautiful, and that they will embrace one another with tears of joy and happiness like brothers. Not at all. The scraps of white cloth will be put away, and once again the engines of death and suffering will start their whistling. Once again the blood of the innocent will flow, and the air will be filled with their groans and cursing. For obvious reasons, this book of war experiences launched Tolstoy's career as a writer, and upon his return from the war, he was welcomed into the Russian literary establishment. He quickly became friends with leading figures like Turgenev, Goncharov, and Nekrasov. And though going from a 19-year-old gambling addict to war hero and beloved author in just a few short years might seem an astounding turnaround, Tolstoy would later write scathingly about this early period of celebrity. I cannot think of those years without horror, loathing, and heartache. I killed men in war and challenged men to duels in order to kill them. I lost at cards, consumed the labor of the peasants, sentenced them to punishments, lived loosely and deceived people. Lying, robbery, adultery of all kinds, drunkenness, violence, murder. There was no crime I did not commit, and for all that people praised my conduct, and my contemporaries considered me, and still consider me, to be a comparatively moral man. So I lived for 10 years. During that time, I began to write from vanity, covetousness, and pride. In my writings, I did the same as in my life. To get fame and money, for the sake of which I wrote, it was necessary to hide the good and to display the evil. But through this period, the seeds of Tolstoy's moral awakening were still sprouting. How else could he have been capable of self-loathing if Tolstoy was not aware of some higher ideal? He not only advocated for the freeing of the serfs, but established free schools for the peasants on his estate, and he began a lifelong quest to understand how universal literacy might be achieved in Russia. Though these actions may seem small now, they rightly establish him as one of the pioneers of public education. And yet, at this time, he was still just a repentant nobleman, aware of his own failings, but unsure of the answer to the cruelty and hatred in his own heart, let alone that of the world around him. However, he would later describe his work in establishing public schools and penning textbooks for the peasant children as the most important thing he ever did. It's interesting to note that Tolstoy's spiritual awakening emerges from amongst the tangled issues of education, the enslavement of the serfs, and his own complicity in the collective suffering not just of the Russian people, but all human beings. It seems a direct consequence not just of his experiences in war and his dislike of his own aristocratic class, but of a suspicion he directs towards his own genius as a writer. He sees himself and Russia's other leading lights as teachers, and their books as nothing but confused and useless lessons. I realized, Tolstoy writes, that one could not teach without knowing what, for I saw that people all taught differently, and by quarreling among themselves, only succeeded in hiding their own ignorance from one another. So if the author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina thinks literary activity was only the concealment of his and other intellectuals' ignorance, what's left? What can Tolstoy possibly do? What has been the point of his life and all its struggles? For a few years following this early period, Tolstoy took refuge in the comforts of family life, but he couldn't long escape his yearning for the green stick and its secret to human happiness. Like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy was a man of such moral sensitivity that the questions of why he should go on living and how he should behave could not be answered by simple traditional culture or the simple momentum of a life in which he needed to provide for his family. So finally, at the age of 50, his guilt over his sexual sin, his gambling addiction, his literary celebrity, and his benefiting from the oppression of the serfs all came to a head, and he began to ask himself the most dangerous question a man can ask. He explains his crisis in the clearest possible terms. My question, that which at the age of 50 brought me to the verge of suicide, was the simplest of questions, lying in the soul of every man, from the foolish child to the wisest elder. It was a question without answering which one cannot live, as I had found by experience. It was, what will come of what I am doing today or shall do tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Elsewhere, he describes how immediate and how horribly real his doubts about the meaning of life had become. I could not attach any rational meaning to a single action of my life. I was only surprised that I had not understood this from the beginning. It had long been clear to me that life had no meaning. I was afraid to be left alone with a rope, lest I should hang myself. I was afraid to go out hunting, lest I should yield to the temptation of putting an end to myself with my gun. So I hid the rope from myself and gave up hunting, that I might not be tempted. Tolstoy had long since sought and failed to find the answer to his question in modern science. He describes that answer as such. The scientists say, to the question of what you are and why you live, we have no reply, and are not occupied therewith. But if you want to know the laws of light, of chemical combination, the law of development of organisms, if you want to know the laws of bodies and their forms, if you want to know the laws of your mind, to all that we have clear, exact, and unquestionable replies. It's easy to understand Tolstoy's dissatisfaction with this cold, scientific answer, and the sort of ungrounded philosophic answers his literary peers were likely to provide. To him, Western philosophy only put his question in more exact terms. but it could provide no answer that might actually guide man's life. Professorial philosophy only categorizes all existing phenomena. It cannot explain them, or derive a course of action from those categorizations. And in the great wise men of history, from Socrates to Buddha to Schopenhauer, Tolstoy found only a nullification of life, best summarized by the words of Solomon. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh. But the earth abides forever. The thing that hath been is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. So if it's in these stark terms we can understand Tolstoy's personal crisis, and his denial of the hedonistic pleasures of aristocratic life, the cold, clinical non-answers of modern science, the total nullification of Eastern wisdom, the empty ritual and superstition of the Russian church, the question still remains: what answer did Tolstoy find? Because Tolstoy did not end his life at the age of 50. He carried on. So what happened? Once he'd seen through the veil of every possible comfort and every conceivable systematic explanation of human existence, what was left? What would come of Tolstoy's life? What might be written on the green stick he'd searched for so many years before? This answer came not from a grand vision of angels or years spent meditating in a cave. It was the Russian peasants who provided Tolstoy with his first clue to the solution to his problem. He noticed that somehow, those who were most humble, who could not even read nor properly understand the philosophical and religious texts he'd agonized over, were able to live perfectly well. They didn't despair as he did. They abhorred suicide and did not see life as an insoluble problem or themselves as irredeemable. These peasants and common people, such as the very ones that supported Tolstoy's own lifestyle, somehow possessed enough vital and moral power not just to endure their difficult lives, but to support the lives of all of Russian society. And these people were not ignorant to the problem of life, but perfectly aware of it and ever in confrontation with it because they were deprived of the many hedonistic escapes available to the ruling classes. Their answer, Tolstoy realized, lay in a rational knowledge, in faith in God, in the Trinity, and the creation in 6 days, in the devils and angels. But Tolstoy found he couldn't believe that either. His doubts denied him both the comforts of folk superstitions and a simple unquestioning faith in God, while his moral conscience denied him the privilege of ignoring the question through aristocratic diversions like hunting and gambling. So what could he do? What can any of us do when we see that rational knowledge reduces life to something pointless and senseless, but that irrational knowledge or faith, which makes life endurable, is ever out of reach because of our own skepticism? Tolstoy's answer is a moral and not a mystical one. We find the meaning of life not in superstitions or visions, but moral responsibility and charity. To Tolstoy, the meaninglessness and torment of modern life comes not from an actual lack of meaning, but from our disobedience to God's will, which is obvious and easy to follow when we are not clouded by luxury in a parasitic lifestyle. He gives a metaphor in which we human beings are servants and God is the master. In this we see what Tolstoy believes is the necessary relation between man and God. If a naked, hungry beggar has been taken into a building belonging to a beautiful establishment, fed, supplied with drink, and then obliged to move a handle up and down before discussing why he was taken and why he should move the handle and whether the whole establishment is reasonably arranged, the beggar should first move the handle. If he moves the handle, he will understand that the handle works a pump. The pump draws water. The water irrigates the garden beds. He will be taken from the pumping station to another place to gather fruits and enter into the joy of his master. But we, the wise, eat the master's food but do not do what he wishes, and instead sit in a circle and discuss, why should that handle be moved? Isn't it stupid? We have decided that the master is stupid or does not exist, and that we are wise. It's interesting to note the way this fable mirrors Kierkegaard's concept of the leap of faith. Tolstoy is essentially saying that by accepting responsibility for our existence and providing for ourselves and others, in this way we enjoy the natural rhythms of life and we can experience the reality of God. But by refusing to work and act and participate in the labor of creating and sustaining life and humanity, we are thrown into outer darkness, where it's not possible to feel God or his plan, and so our arrogance and questioning comes in to fill the gap within ourselves. But this is only one half of the foundation for Tolstoy's hard-won faith. The other is perhaps even more interesting, because it derives from doubt, and the torment of doubt, and the feeling of being locked out of God's kingdom, which Tolstoy knew so well. I could not be a fledgling fallen from its nest as I felt myself to be. Or, granting that I be such, lying on my back, crying in the high grass, even then I cry because I know that a mother has borne me within her, has hatched me, warmed me, fed me, and loved me. Where is she, that mother? If I have been deserted, who deserted me? I cannot hide from myself that someone bore me, loving me. Who was that someone? Again, God? So it was Tolstoy's feeling of being abandoned by God that he finally derived his faith in God. It was his belief of having fallen away from something or broken off from something that finally led him back onto the path of being found again. But it didn't come in a flash. Tolstoy describes hundreds of cycles of spiritual death and reanimation, wherein he achieved a sense of faith, felt himself come to life for a moment, only to die yet again as new doubts snuck in. Tolstoy, like all of us, craved a grand, mystical experience of God, and sure proof that this feeling that animated him and allowed him to live was not just a feeling, but the sign of something outside of himself. But then at last, a voice within him spoke in definitive terms. What is this animation in dying? I do not live when I lose belief in the existence of God. I should long ago have killed had I not had a dim hope of finding him. I live, really live, only when I feel him and seek him. So what more do you seek? Exclaimed a voice within me. This is he. He is that which one cannot live without. To know God and to live is one and the same thing. God is life. Live seeking God, and you will not live without God. And more than ever before, all within me and around me lit up, and the light did not again abandon me. And it didn't. For the rest of his life, Tolstoy committed himself to his own radical form of Christianity, which taught that Christ was not divine, that there was no Trinity, no creation in 6 days, and no devil. He sold pieces of his estate back to the peasants and wrote only one more novel despite the runaway success of Anna Karenina, and instead devoted himself to composing explanations of his religious beliefs. These tracts, though suppressed in Russia, found their way to the upper classes both in Russia and all around the world, and the Tolstoyans became a sect among many radical Christian sects, with their own communes both in Russia and abroad. Tolstoy was even excommunicated by the Orthodox Church in 1901, much to his delight. He's known to have said that he welcomed exile or imprisonment, but the Russian Tsar wisely denied him that martyrdom, because by this time, he was perhaps the most famous writer and thinker in the entire world, receiving thousands of letters a year from admirers ranging from a young Gandhi to the poet Rilke to the playwright Chekhov. At the same time, his estate became a pilgrimage site, with hundreds arriving each year to try and catch a glimpse of the great writer, sage, and mystic. Visitors were known to be shocked at how short he actually was. The image of Tolstoy at this time was an immensely physical sort of folk hero, always working with the peasants, working the land, after the style of wandering warriors in old Russian tales. He was somehow beloved in the eyes of God, immensely wealthy, a man of the people, and also the country's greatest literary genius. Despite the two never actually meeting, Dostoevsky once called Tolstoy the god of art. And now, it seemed that people were taking him, with his long beard and piercing stare, as a representative of Father God himself. Though this may seem like a happy ending, because Tolstoy got to spend his last years as a world-famous sage and outspoken rebel against the aristocratic system he'd long despised, we can't help but look at the last years of Tolstoy's life and know that something is coming. Something that would cast Tolstoy's legacy as spiritual father to movements such as those of Gandhi and Martin Luther King in an entirely new light. Because what were the real, observable results of Tolstoy's spiritual influence in Russia? It could easily be argued that his excommunication, unpopular as it was, helped to delegitimize the Tsar, and his writings against both church and the moderate, liberalizing members of the government and Russian elite, in which he cast them as irredeemable hypocrites, defanged all those who might have resisted a man who, though professing what might seem similar to the ideas of Tolstoy, was no pacifist. A man whose actions would tear Russia apart and lead to the rise of Stalin and a level of systematic oppression that makes even Tsarist Russia seem mild. This man, of course, was Vladimir Lenin. So in this way, Tolstoy's writings helped pave the way for Stalin's 1929 collectivization of agriculture, which amounted ironically to the re-enslavement of the peasant class Tolstoy had so loved and so wanted to see made free. In this light, it's hard to see Tolstoy as anything but an immensely naive and irresponsible thinker. The theology that he would develop after his spiritual awakening amounted to a belief that Christ did not exaggerate when he said, "Resist not evil," which means that courts, armies, states, and all institutions of all kinds were morally bankrupt and should thus be dissolved. Tolstoy's greatest weakness as a thinker was in failing to confront the challenges that would naturally arise from such radical pacifism. He never dares ask questions like, if I walked in on a child being abused, would I not use violence to stop that act? Would I simply stand there and watch? And that lack of questioning makes it hard to respect him on some level. How can someone have the audacity to tell the entire world to convert to a new moral order without even confronting the most obvious issues that arise from that order? And if Christ isn't divine, as Tolstoy believed, what grants this new moral order such authority? Isn't the ultimate authority, if Christ was just a man, the one who interprets and disseminates the thoughts of that man, which would then be Tolstoy? It's often forgotten how secular Tolstoy's Christianity was. When writing of the Christian belief in Jesus as the Son of God, he wrote, "To represent Christ as God is to destroy the whole meaning of his teaching. If Christ is God, then his sufferings lose all significance for men." The most common insult applied to Tolstoy throughout his life was arrogant, and I find it hard to disagree when I think on how quickly he cast aside all prior theology and philosophy in favor of his own idiosyncratic belief in Christianity, which basically stated that Christianity is the Sermon on the Mount and nothing else. Just like the Orthodox Christians he so despised, and every cult leader in every country around the world, Tolstoy seems to have taken one aspect of a religion, elevated it above all the others, and then claimed his interpretation was sacrosanct. And who paid the price? Not Tolstoy so much as the millions who would suffer decades later under the Soviet Union. And though Tolstoy would surely have hated Lenin, Stalin, and all they stood for, they would later elevate his writings to the very highest places of honor in Russian culture. Lenin even explicitly named him as a precursor to the revolution. He devoted several articles to discussing Tolstoy's life and legacy, and wrote that Tolstoy's criticism was directed against everything that is false, everything that is hypocritical, everything that is rotten in modern society. But his doctrine was one of non-resistance, of renunciation of struggle, of passive submission to evil. That is why Tolstoy could not become the ideologist of the proletariat. But despite this shadow cast by Tolstoy's legacy, and his arrogance, and his disregard for a certain kind of philosophical rigor, I find it impossible not to admire Tolstoy. The man who emerges from his novels, memoirs, and journals is one who is from his very first years earnestly seeking purification and perfection, not just in himself, but the world as a whole. He saw the world and his soul as intimately connected, and knew that the world's failings were his own failings, and that one could not be healed without the other. He sought the truth with all his stupendous energy, even when the realization of that truth stood to ruin his life. He didn't hide from the fact that his life was built on the oppression of the serfs, but rather made that the central fact of his existence, and did as much as anyone in Russia at that time to work for the serfs' freedom, education, and welfare. That he woke up to that moral horror and confronted it, often alone and unsupported by other members of his class, and even his own family, demands respect. For that reason alone, I believe he stands with moral authority amongst the first abolitionists, who against all cultural precedent decided that the ancient system, which so benefited them, had to be ended by any means necessary. He saw the many injustices baked into Russian society, and the way they had spread dark tendrils not just into the world, but his own heart, making parasites of him and all others of his class, which then cut them off from God and the meaning of life itself. Tolstoy didn't just try to end this injustice, but to heal the rift between himself and God, and from his first diaries, written while suffering from a venereal disease, or after having gambled away an entire village, he never backed down from his goal of self-purification and moral evolution. He never stopped confronting himself. That, I think, is Tolstoy's real legacy, beyond his many failures as not just a thought leader and philosopher, but as father, husband, and advocate for the peasants. Count Leo Tolstoy tried, and tried not just for marginal improvements in himself and the world, but for an almost impossible ideal. And he didn't stop trying, not as an 8-year-old boy searching for the secrets of happiness scrawled on a stick, or as an old man dying in a train stop, asking how peasants die. In some ways, despite his moral evolution, he remained the same thing throughout his life, a seeker after the truth, and one who wielded power on behalf of those who had none. So when I think of Tolstoy, I think of his trying, desperately trying to be good, to be righteous, and to be godly, even within a system that rewarded none of those things. And I remember the quote by G.K. Chesterton: "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried." But who could deny that Leo Tolstoy truly tried? Following his death in 1910, journalists flooded the train station, and all around the world, newspapers and telegrams reported the passing of this great man. Thousands of peasants marched in his honor, and the Tsarist government feared mass demonstrations and even the possibility of revolution. But no state funeral nor any grand monument was built. Count Leo Tolstoy was buried, in accordance with his wishes, in a small grassy ravine on his estate, where 70 years earlier he'd searched for a stick bearing the secret to universal love and happiness. And perhaps then, as he was laid to rest, he found it at last.